Good evening, everyone. I mentioned that I would be going into Genesis to start talking about the flood and the Tower of Babel, which I will be doing, but I realized there are a couple more videos I need to make on Revelation, consistent with our ongoing motif about the nature of Yahweh. This will be an extension of the last video where we talked about who the enemy is and who the good guys are in Revelation 20 to 20, excuse me, in Revelation 20 through 22, as compared with what we see in Ezekiel 40, well, 38 to 39. That's where the battle of Gog and Magog is discussed in the Old Testament, Ezekiel 38 to 39. I believe I misspoke in the last video by saying chapters 48 to 49. There is no chapter 49 in Ezekiel. 48 is the last chapter, and Gog and Magog are discussed in chapters 38 to 39. I want to call your attention to the fact that a lot of the events as they are described in Ezekiel 38 to 39, as well as chapter 47, where the rebuilding of the third temple is recounted in great detail, that those things are, the fulfillment of those things are proceeding apace right now. Now, I don't say this because I believe that that the Old Testament is inspired, and that what we're witnessing is some miracle or evidence that a transcendent God, not that I don't believe in a transcendent God, I'm not an Abrahamic though, I'm not an Abrahamist, so I don't believe that Yahweh is the the supreme creator, the supreme God. I don't believe he had this amazing foresight in Ezekiel, and that what we're seeing today in the Middle East, and with the building of the third temple, which is nearly complete, is somehow evidence that Judaism is true, or that Christianity on any level is true. I think it testifies to the power of politics and money, and the ability to therefore engage in what we call self-fulfilling prophecy. So you have these prophecies, and now you have the people today, centuries and centuries later, manipulating events in order to bring about a confluence of occurrences that are designed to appear as fulfilling ancient prophecy. First off, I'm not going to do a verse by verse exegesis of Ezekiel 38 and 39. I would recommend, or I would encourage you to go read them, those two chapters. But I'll just make a few salient points relative to the topic. And that is that the language of Ezekiel 39 in particular is not just suggestive, but I would say expressly indicating that Gog and Magog were the Battle of Gog and Magog was intended, together with the completion of the temple as described by Ezekiel in Ezekiel 47, was intended to be fulfilled sometime after, in the near future, sometime after God gathered the Jews from amongst the peoples, from amongst the nations, after their dispersal and diaspora, after the captivity in Babylon. That didn't happen, and the second temple wasn't even up to the specifications of Ezekiel's temple in Ezekiel 47. And there certainly wasn't a river flowing out from the precincts of the temple. And the dimensions weren't even what they should be. There was a lot of detail in Ezekiel 47 that's not characteristic of the second temple, which was eventually destroyed by the Roman armies in 70 CE. So Judaism continues to push this prophecy out and stretch it out further. And we're expected to believe that this is going to happen eventually, and Ezekiel didn't really have in mind that this was going to be fulfilled, centuries ago, but that this was something that was going to be, it was going to take millennia to be fulfilled. Again, I think the language of Ezekiel 39 shows that that's a bunch of hooey. But that's what they do with their texts, and they do the same thing with Daniel. Jews and Christians do the same thing with Daniel. It was clear from Daniel 8 that Daniel at the time, we already did a short series on that where we showed that the author of Daniel was not writing in the 5th century BCE, but rather the 6th century BCE, but rather in the 2nd century BCE during the Hellenistic period or the Maccabean era, and that he was writing about current events, and they were amazingly accurate for the most part, but there are a few exceptions to that, because he was anticipating certain things happening. There were events going on at that time that were that were, you could kind of see the handwriting on the wall. There was a certain trajectory to these events, and he kind of anticipated their conclusion, that they would conclude in a particular manner, and there were some details there. We look back at history and we can see that they did not conclude in the manner that he expected them to, due to the fact that Rome intervened with Antiochus Epiphanes. But the events that occurred, that he's describing, that were occurring in that period were amazingly lucid and accurate as compared with the history and information he provided regarding events far earlier than that, during the period in which the author claims Daniel was actually writing the book, but the details as given there were far less accurate. So they do the same thing with Daniel. Daniel 8 says that all of this, that the beast was going to make war on the saints in, he identifies the beast as Greek is the point I'm trying to make there. He explicitly says the beast is Greek. And then preterist Christians say, well, Daniel was talking about Rome. Well, that's not true. He was clearly talking about Greece. And then Judaism says that the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9, we're still awaiting its fulfillment. So anyway, but regardless, this is what they think. Even though even though this hasn't happened, even though it was supposed to happen and didn't, it's still supposed to happen according to Judaism. This war is still supposed to take place. So they're going about their business now, making the final preparations for the third temple. And I would imagine they've got some plans to have a river come out from the middle of the temple. They're probably going to dig some giant canal. I would imagine so, that they're working on that in fulfillment of Ezekiel's, river of water of life, which we also see in Revelation, only it's predicated of the New Jerusalem rather than of the third temple. But while this is going on, we now have a 2-year-long, well, how long has it been now? About a year, right? I think the war started in October of 2023. So the war between the Palestinians, which is not really much of a war, since they're being, the Palestinians are essentially being ground to dust in a genocide. That's been going for almost a year. It's interesting in Ukraine, this Ukrainian-Russian conflict is very much along the same lines. If you understand anything about who runs the country in Ukraine. And so the same people who are behind the destruction of the Palestinians, not just Muslims but also Christians, are running things over there and trying to reconstitute the empire of Khazaria. Khazaria had its beginnings in the 6th century CE and reached its apogee in the commercially in the 8th century CE. They consisted of Turkic people who converted to Judaism, which at the time supposedly was more of a practical decision, more of a diplomatic or strategic decision, because they were sandwiched between the Byzantine Empire on the one hand, the Christian Byzantine Empire, and Muslims on the other side. And they didn't want to piss off the Muslims by becoming Christian or to piss off the Christians by becoming Muslim. So they converted to Judaism. But anyway, what we're seeing in Ukraine with the recent, like a month ago, official banning of the canonical or Christian Orthodox Church there, and combined with, if you're familiar with the politics, if you see who's running the country and what their religious affiliations are, you'll see that there is a very self-conscious attempt to reconstitute old Khazaria. And so I connect these two conflicts. And when you consider the obsession today with a lot of these morons filling the pulpits at the evangelical mega churches, constantly engaged in the demonization of countries like Iran and Turkey and Russia as being the future kings of the North, that will come down and invade the modern nation of Israel. They're viewed as the sort of ultimate blasphemers, the enemies of God, due to their adversarial stance toward the modern nation of Israel. Even though they claim to be Christians, while they demonize Christians and defend the nation of Israel, who embraces a religion that they supposedly would reject, given that they worship Jesus. But this is very serious business, because although it's absurd on the one hand, there is a very serious program in place to fulfill to the letter, or to the extent that they can, everything about the battle of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38 to 39. They can't just fulfill the prophecies concerning the temple. That's not enough. They can't just consecrate the temple, consecrate a king, anoint a Messiah, restore animal sacrifice, and slay the red heifer. They also need to be attacked or invaded by an enemy, or surrounded by an enemy. And so I really believe that there are certain factions that are crazy enough to provoke this in order to start a world war. And I think that that is exactly what is developing right now. This is not going to stop with just the Middle East or Russia and Ukraine. All of these events are going to merge into one giant conflagration, or at least that's what they're hoping. That's their goal. That's what they're going to try to provoke. There's no guarantee that it's going to succeed. I'm not suggesting that, but we need to be aware of the fact that that's precisely what is supposed to happen in their minds. Now, Israel isn't going to go they're not going to take on these enemies by themselves. Certainly, they're going to take the precaution of having their allies involved, which will include the United States. But they're going to make it, at some point, they're going to make it look as though, assuming we reach the point where this actually happens, they're going to try to make it look as though they are this beleaguered tiny nation out there with very little help, who has been surrounded from all sides by nations from the north, as it's described, as the battle is described in Ezekiel 38 to 39. And this is where things get even more insane. In Ezekiel 38 to 39, at the last moment, a miracle happens. Fire comes down out of heaven from God and consumes the enemies of Israel who are surrounding it. The result of this victory is supposed to result, again, as recorded explicitly by Ezekiel there in chapters 38 to 39, is supposed to result in the nations of the world being amazed and therefore converting to Judaism. So a lot of things there's a lot of moving parts here. This is not just about the restoration of a temple. This is about starting a world war, and it's about concluding the war in such a way that the world will be wowed into and deceived into embracing this religion. And I believe based on the data and information that we covered in the last series on the Elohim and Anunnaki, the sons of God and the divine council, particularly in those videos where we covered Ezekiel chapter 1, Ezekiel's chariot, and how the description of that chariot, not to mention the chariot of Ezekiel and other places in Scripture, when you do a literal interpretation, a literal translation of the Hebrew, that we covered from Mauro Bellino's book, the Hebrew translator Mauro Bellino, those so-called chariots, which is just the only language they had to describe it back in the day. When you look at the specific description of those chariots, they are describing modern day UFOs, spaceships, 0 point, whatever you want to call it, 0 point energy, zero gravity, high tech. And it's supposed to come down and incinerate Israel's modern enemies. I am convinced that Yahweh is one of the sons of God. He's not the creator. He's a flesh and blood being, though, who rides on a UFO, just as he did in the Old Testament, like we saw on the mountain with Moses, when he took Elijah away, and there in Ezekiel 1, where Ezekiel sees in great detail the Son of Man. I believe these Son of Man texts, Ezekiel 1 and Daniel 7 in the Old Testament, have nothing to do with Jesus. They had to do originally with Yahweh and his flying saucer. But, of course, the early church, in attempting to subvert Yahweh's agenda, want to make these prophecies about Jesus in order to convert Jews from Yahwism to Christianity, because they believed that Yahweh was Satan, that he was a satanic adversary, a harsh disciplinarian, a sadist, not a being that was worthy of being considered the transcendent creator of all things. Not worthy of worship. I really believe, I know it sounds highly sci-fi, but in the 21st century, I don't think it's very difficult to conceive of this playing itself out, this scenario. I think we're sufficiently steeped in knowledge about the development of spacecraft like this, particularly if you're familiar with what the Nazis were engineering during World War II. And if you're familiar with a lot of literature from ancient times and how those texts seem to be describing just what I'm talking about, the texts that are relevant to the Watcher, the stories of the Watchers, and the earlier texts from the Sumerians describing Enlil and Enki and their exploits on this planet. It's not hard to see this playing out. I'm not suggesting that most Jews today necessarily believe that their God is going to come riding in on a UFO. But I do think that high-level esoteric members of the Jewish community believe this, and I think they know something. In fact, I think that they are in communication with Yahweh and his messengers and lieutenants. So this is the UFO deception. This is the essence of it. I don't believe, as many do, that the deception has to do with the narrative that UFOs exist or that off-world intelligences exist. That's not the deception. That's not the conspiracy to get us to believe that. I believe that that's true, that off-world intelligences exist and that UFOs exist. I think the deception, this is where the deception comes in. The deception comes in when this little tiny country in the Middle East sparks a world war and tries to end it in this miraculous fashion, in such a way as to put on a show for the whole planet, so that the planet will be inclined to bow before the Satan of the Old Testament.